You vote for presidents, prime ministers, and parliaments. You watch debates, follow campaigns, and think democracy gives you a voice in how your country is run. But when the real decisions are made, how much money circulates, how much your mortgage costs, how much inflation eats away your paycheck, none of those elected leaders are in charge. Behind every finance minister, behind every economic policy, stands a central banker. Unelected, unaccountable, untouchable. The Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England. These names sound technical, neutral, maybe even boring, but they are the quiet power behind every boom, every bust, and every bailout in modern history. And they have more control over your life than any politician ever will. Before we go further, take a second to hit, like if you've ever wondered who really controls the money supply. Comment below and tell me which country you're watching from and what time it is there, because this topic, how central bankers seize power, isn't just a national story, it's global. Whether you're in the US, India, or Brazil, your economy is being steered by a small club of policymakers who never face an election. Stay until the end, and you'll see exactly how this system was built and why it's nearly impossible to break. To understand how central bankers took over, we have to start with a simple truth. Whoever controls the money controls the world. For centuries, that power belonged to kings and emperors. They minted coins, debased currencies, and paid for wars by stretching the limits of trust. When kings wanted gold, they took it. When they ran out, they printed paper. But as empires fell and industrial economies grew, trust in monarchs collapsed. People wanted stability. Business needed predictable credit. And that's where the bankers saw their chance. In 1694, England created the Bank of England, not a state department, but a private institution lending money to the crown. It wasn't just a bank, it was a partnership between government and finance. The government got cash for wars. The bankers got guaranteed interest and the right to issue currency backed by the state. It was the original deal with the devil. That idea spread fast. By the 19th century, every major empire had a central bank. They promised order. They promised to keep gold reserves and issue banknotes only when backed by metal. But behind the scenes, they played a different game. They lent far more than they held. They created credit from nothing. And they used crises, bank runs, recessions, defaults as justification for more power. When a private bank collapsed, they stepped in as lender of last resort. When governments needed funds, they printed more paper. Each panic strengthened their grip. Each bailout deepened dependence. It wasn't conspiracy, it was evolution. A system built on trust could only survive if someone had the authority to create more of it. By the early 20th century, the United States was the biggest economy on earth, but it had no central bank. Recessions came in waves. The panic of 1907 nearly destroyed Wall Street. Who saved it? Not the president, not Congress. It was one man, J.P. Morgan. He locked the city's bankers in his mansion, forced them to coordinate credit, and single-handedly stopped the collapse. The message was clear. Private finance ruled public policy. So, in 1913, under pressure from bankers and industrialists, Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act. The Fed was born, not a government agency, but a hybrid system owned by private banks and managed by appointed governors. It could create money, it could lend to the government, and it was largely beyond democratic reach. From that moment, power shifted. Presidents changed, Congress debated, but the Fed stayed. Through the Roaring '20s, it fueled the bubble with cheap credit. Through the Great Depression, it tightened too late. In World War II, it printed endlessly to fund the war machine. Every crisis gave it a bigger role. Every intervention justified more authority. And every policy mistake was met with the same excuse. We'll fix it next time. Yet every fix required more control. By the time Bretton Woods ended in 1971 and the dollar broke free from gold, the game was over. Money was no longer limited by metal. It was limited only by central bankers' promises. Modern central banks can create trillions with a keystroke. They buy bonds, stocks, even corporate debt. They set the cost of borrowing for every business and household. And in every downturn, they rescue markets before they rescue people. When a bank fails, they print. When a hedge fund collapses, they print. When inflation spikes, they raise rates and cause a recession. You live with the results, but you never voted for the cause. This is why critics call it the quiet coup. A transfer of power from parliaments to policy boards, from ballots to balance sheets. The European Central Bank, unelected and independent, dictates austerity to nations like Greece and Italy. The Bank of Japan buys half its stock market to prop up prices. The Federal Reserve finances trillion-dollar deficits with money from nothing. This isn't conspiracy theory, it's the daily operation of global finance. Central banks were supposed to be neutral referees. They become players, deciding winners and losers in real time. If you run a bank, they'll save you. If you lose your job, they'll say it's necessary to cool inflation. They use technical language, liquidity, quantitative easing, normalization, to mask political power. But here's the question most people never ask. What happens when unelected officials become the only ones trusted to steer the economy? democracy fades, markets become addicted. Governments stop making hard choices because the central bank can always print the pain away, and each rescue plants the seed for the next crisis. Every intervention distorts prices, inflates assets, and widens inequality. Central banks say they fight instability, but they created the conditions for permanent fragility. We'll dig deeper into that next, because once you see how they coordinate, how a handful of meetings between a few men in Basel or Washington set the fate of 8 billion people, you'll understand why some call this the most successful power grab in history. Let's strip away the complexity for a second. Central banking isn't magic. It's just power disguised as math. The language is technical, but the mechanics are simple. Imagine you run a household. You can't print your own money. You can't set your own interest rate. You live by what you earn. But central banks? They operate under a different set of laws. They can create digital money with a keystroke and buy assets from commercial banks. That new money flows into the financial system, inflating the value of stocks, bonds, and housing. Ordinary people feel richer for a while. Then inflation arrives. Prices rise. Wages lag. And by the time the bill comes due, the only ones who gained are those closest to the printer. This is called the Cantillon effect. The first recipients of new money, banks, corporations, and governments, benefit from spending it before prices adjust. Everyone else receives it later, when goods already cost more. It's an invisible tax, a redistribution mechanism hidden behind monetary policy. When the Federal Reserve prints trillions, it doesn't hand checks to workers. It buys bonds from big financial institutions. Those institutions use cheap credit to speculate, not to build factories. Asset prices soar, but everyday life becomes harder. A house that cost $200,000 a decade ago now sells for $500,000. Your salary didn't double, but your rent did. That's not an accident. That's policy. The Fed calls this trickle-down stability. The European Central Bank calls it market confidence. The Bank of Japan calls it yield control. But the effect is the same. Wealth flows upward, inequality deepens, and ordinary citizens are told to be patient while the data improves. Central bankers don't need elections because markets reward them for keeping asset prices high. When the Dow rises, everyone cheers. When inflation spikes, they blame external shocks. Yet the root cause is always the same: easy money. Let's look back at 2008. The financial system imploded under the weight of its own leverage. Mortgages were bundled, resold, and bet upon like poker chips. When the collapse came, millions lost their homes. Did anyone go to jail? No. The banks that caused the crisis were bailed out by the same central banks that claimed to regulate them. The Fed created emergency lending programs, buying toxic assets with money created from thin air. Now, the message was loud and clear. If you're too big to fail, you'll always be saved. That was the birth of moral hazard on a planetary scale. From that moment, risk disappeared for the elite. If markets crash, the Fed cuts rates. If inflation rises, they blame consumers. And every solution injects more liquidity, making the next crash even bigger. The 2008 bailout was supposed to be temporary, but it never ended. Central banks kept rates near zero for over a decade. Trillions of dollars flooded into speculative assets, crypto, tech stocks, housing bubbles across the globe. Then came the pandemic, another excuse to print, another emergency. Within months, central banks created more money than in the previous century combined. And when inflation finally hit, they claimed to be surprised. Let's be honest, they weren't surprised. They knew exactly what they were doing. Because inflation doesn't hurt the rich. It hurts savers, pensioners, and workers who live paycheck to paycheck. And every time your dollar loses value, government debt becomes easier to pay. That's the hidden alliance. Central banks and states working hand in hand. The bankers create money, the politicians spend it, and the people absorb the cost through higher prices. It's not democracy, it's debt-based feudalism. Here's how the cycle works. When times are good, central banks keep rates low to stimulate growth. That fuels borrowing, speculation, and asset inflation. When prices rise, they hike rates to cool the economy, triggering recessions. Jobs vanish, businesses fold, but the same banks that caused the crisis get bailouts. Then they cut rates again, and the cycle restarts. It's a pendulum that always swings in favor of financial elites, because whether money is cheap or expensive, the system ensures those who control it never lose. Now, here's where the story gets darker. Central banks aren't just national anymore, they're global. They meet regularly at the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, in Basel, Switzerland. The BIS is often called the central bank of central banks. It operates above national law, immune from taxation and oversight. Inside its walls, representatives from the Federal Reserve, ECB, and Bank of Japan coordinate policy. They don't vote, they don't debate publicly, yet their decisions move trillions in global markets. When they agree to raise rates, developing nations suffer. When they flood the system with dollars, commodity prices explode. One meeting can make or break entire economies. During the 1980s, the BIS coordinated the Plaza Accord, which revalued major currencies. In 2008, it helped organize global liquidity swaps. Today, it's leading research on central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, programmable money that could track every transaction. Think about that. The same unelected officials who caused inflation now want total control over digital cash. They can issue it, freeze it, tax it instantly. Imagine a world where your paycheck expires if you don't spend it, or your balance is cut because you bought too much gas. That's not science fiction. It's policy being tested right now. But here's the paradox. Central banks claim independence from politics. They say their decisions are data-driven. Yet every major intervention, every rate cut, every stimulus, every QE program has profound political consequences. They decide who suffers inflation, who gets credit, and who bears austerity. They are the invisible hand behind every fiscal crisis. And when people protest, politicians shrug and say, it's up to the central bank. That's the brilliance of the coup. It hides behind expertise. No one can question it without being labeled ignorant. Meanwhile, the real economy rots. Productivity stagnates. Savings disappear. Young people can't afford homes. But stock markets break records. Corporate profits soar. That's not a healthy system. That's monetary engineering. A global casino rigged to favor those who sit closest to the money spigot. And when it finally breaks, central bankers will step forward once again to save the world from chaos they created. We're heading toward that moment. The debt is too high. The interest burden is crushing. Inflation is sticky. And trust is fading. The only question is, what comes next? In the final section, we all reveal how this power structure sustains itself and what happens when the public finally realizes that their democracy is just a shadow cast by the central bank as balance sheet. The most dangerous thing about power is when it becomes invisible. Central bankers don't wear crowns or command armies. They don't pass laws or run for office. Yet with a single announcement, they can move the value of your savings, your mortgage, your rent, even your job. Every time you see headlines like markets rally after Fed meeting or how investors brace for ECB decision, you're watching unelected officials reshape the world economy in real time. They are not villains in a movie. They are technocrats operating under the illusion of neutrality. But neutrality doesn't exist when your decisions decide who gets rich and who gets left behind. Let's take a closer look at how this invisible empire sustains itself. At the top sits a network. The Federal Reserve in the US, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, the People's Bank of China, all interconnected through institutions like the IMF and BIS. When crises hit, they coordinate responses, lending each other currencies through swap lines. It sounds technical, but it means this. Global liquidity is managed by a few hands. No matter where you live, your economy dances to their rhythm. Your inflation rate, your interest payments, your access to credit, all flow from decisions made in boardrooms you'll never see. The justification is always the same: stability. They say without central banks, recessions would be deeper, unemployment higher, markets more chaotic, and maybe that was true a century ago. But what began as a safety net has become a weapon. Modern monetary policy is no longer about smoothing business cycles. It is about preserving asset prices at all costs. The proof? Every major downturn now triggers a rescue. When the market sneezes, the Fed prints trillions. When banks make bad bets, they're shielded. When inflation surges, the same policymakers act shocked, as if they didn't want to spend the past decade flooding the system with cheap credit. This is not capitalism as we were taught. It's a hybrid system. Part socialism for the rich, part austerity for everyone else. Risk has been privatized into profit, and loss has been socialized into national debt. The irony? Central banks were created to prevent exactly this. When the Federal Reserve was established in 1913, its mission was to ensure sound money. Yet, over a century later, the dollar has lost over 95% of its purchasing power. That's not soundness. That's slow-motion theft, masked by economic jargon. Let's trace this theft through time. In 1971, President Nixon ended the gold standard, severing the dollar's link to real value. From that moment, money became pure debt, a promise backed only by faith. The Fed could now print without restraint. And every dollar created since then has diluted the value of every dollar before. That's the inflation tax. Silent, relentless, and perfectly legal. You don't vote for it. You don't see it on your paycheck. But you feel it every time your grocery bill rises faster than your wage. And when you protest, they say inflation is transitory. It's not. It's engineered. Consider this. The average working family spends over half their income on housing, food, and transportation. All sectors inflated by cheap credit. Meanwhile, financial assets, stocks, bonds, real estate have grown at exponential rates. Those who already owned them gained wealth effortlessly. Those who didn't fell behind. Central banks call it wealth effect. But let's call it what it is. Class warfare disguised as monetary policy. Even the myth of independence has cracks. In 2020, when COVID shut down the world, central banks became the main source of government funding. Trillions were printed to pay for stimulus checks, bailouts, and emergency programs. It blurred the line between fiscal and monetary power completely. The supposed neutral institutions were now financing political agendas, choosing winners and losers under the banner of crisis management. That was the moment the coup became complete. Because once politicians realized they could spend without limit, as long as the central bank printed, accountability vanished. And now, as the debt explodes past $35 trillion in the US alone, there's no exit strategy left. Raising rates risks crashing the system. Cutting them fuels inflation. Every move has consequences. So the bankers stall, pretending they can thread the needle. But deep down, they know this game can't last forever. Every empire built on paper money eventually reaches a breaking point where trust evaporates faster than currency can be printed. Weimar Germany learned it. Zimbabwe lived it. Argentina still fights it. The question is not if the current system fails, but how it resets. Central bankers already have a plan: central bank digital currencies. Unlike Bitcoin, they're not decentralized. They're programmable, trackable, and fully controlled. Imagine a world where every transaction is monitored, every account can be frozen, and every policy can be enforced instantly. Want to stimulate spending? They'll add an expiration date to your money. Want to curb carbon emissions? They'll limit your fuel purchases. Want to impose sanctions? They'll flick a switch. It's ultimate power. Not through armies, but through algorithms. This isn't speculation, it's in motion. Over 130 countries are exploring CBDCs, led by the same institutions that caused today's inflation. The narrative will be simple. Digital money is safer, faster, and fairer. But the real motive is control. Paper cash gives you freedom to save, to transact privately, to resist. Digital cash ends that. And the architects of this system? The same central bankers who once swore they only cared about stability. Now, let's take a step back. How did we allow unelected officials to gain this much power? Because they operate in the shadows, behind complex language, graphs, and promises of expertise. We were told economics is too complicated for ordinary people. But it's not. It's just math with moral consequences. Every policy has winners and losers. Every rate cut transfers wealth. Every bailout rewrites the rules. The truth is, the coup didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, through decades of dependency. Governments borrowed too much. Banks took too many risks. And when the system wobbled, central banks stepped in, until stepping in became the system itself. So, what happens next? Maybe the bubble keeps inflating. Maybe digital money arrives quietly and people embrace convenience over privacy. Or maybe, just maybe, the illusion cracks. People start asking the forbidden questions. Who gave them this power? Who benefits from it? And how do we take it back? History tells us that no empire of control lasts forever. Sooner or later, trust breaks. And when it does, the reset one to come from a banker EES meeting. It'll come from the people who finally see the strings. Because once you realize money isn't neutral, you start to see the world differently. Every crisis, every boom, every miracle recovery, all engineered. The central banker's coup didn't happen with violence. It happened with consent, quietly, technocratically, through the promise of safety